The cocos were used to make the flood water drain away, and we know this because she writes, bit by bit the water drained away into a canal at the back of the village, and that's the quotation really that supports that. And here's a coco actually in Guyana, and you can see how brown the water is, and that's because if they've had flooding, that's going to wash some of the earth and mud into the river, and that's what makes it go so brown. Question 3. The writer chooses words and phrases carefully to help the reader to imagine what her childhood was like. Complete the table to show how she does this. One example has been done to help you. And for this one, you then have to find the quotation first and then explain how they help the reader to imagine what her childhood was like. So the example that's been given is brown silky water, and the explanation is silky makes the water sound very smooth and soft to touch. So I now need you to find 2 more examples, so you might just want to pause before you move on to the next slide. Now, there are lots of different things you could have chosen to answer this question, and I can't cover them all, so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, but you might have chosen different examples, and as long as you've backed it up, it's going to be the right answer. So the ones I've chosen is just before the last bit of darkness disappeared from the skies. And it helps us to imagine her childhood because it makes us think she's allowed out before it was really light. It sounds like a big adventure, she's being allowed out in the dark. And the next one I chose was the hot sun would soon make everything dry. And the explanation I've given is this makes it sound as though the weather was always lovely and warm when she was young. You could have mentioned the fun with the slippery fish, trying to catch the fish, and also the thing about the crabs. Also about the fact that she seems to come from quite a big family. All of those would have been absolutely fine. And question number 4 is, how do we know that the writer enjoyed her childhood? Answer as fully as you can and refer to the text in your answer. So when it says refer to the text, again, it means can you find a quotation or can you summarize what she says? Okay, so you need evidence to back up your point. So again, you might want to pause this before you go on to the answers. Now for this one, like the last question, you could have chosen lots of different examples. Now I've deliberately not used a quotation in mine. Instead I've summarized because I wanted to show you how to do that. To summarize means that the quotation would have been too long. I would have had to use too much of the text. So I've made it shorter by using my own words and giving a shorter explanation. So I've written, we know that she enjoyed her childhood because all her memories are really happy and the weather is really hot. She doesn't seem upset about the gardens being flooded. Instead, she makes it sound like fun because she describes the feeling of trying to catch the fish. Even when it rains hard, the water is fun to play in and soon drains away. You could have mentioned again her big family. You could have mentioned trying to find the crabs, and actually you could have mentioned her description of the coco because she seemed to find that really quite interesting. Question number 5 is you're asked to reread the poem I Am a Parrot, and the question is, how does the writer make us feel sorry for the parrot? And again, you might want to go back and have a look at the poem again before you answer this question. So there are obviously lots of different ways of answering a question like this because it's about your response to the poem. So as long as you back it up with evidence, anything that you write actually is going to be okay. So this is just my version of it, but it's not the only one. So the writer makes us feel sorry for the parrot by saying that the parrot misses its old life and it is trapped. It makes the parrot's old life feel lovely by saying things like luscious green forest canopy and I miss the wind against my wing. Now that the parrot is in a cage, it is in a vex-up rage, which means it is angry and unhappy. Analysing it at a more sophisticated level, you could also have written about the fact that the stanzas, the verses which are about its old free life, they're all different because as the parrot flies around the forest, it's going to see lots of different views. But the stanzas which are about the parrot being in the cage, they're all the same, because a parrot in a cage is always going to have the same view, and it's going to be trapped in its cage just like it's trapped in this poem. So it's that contrast. The next question is about organisation, about what things look like on the page. It's what we sometimes call structure. And what it asks you to do, it says, look again at the poem I Am a Parrot and the account of the writer's childhood. The same writer wrote both texts, but she has organised them differently. Find two differences between the way she has organised the poem and the account of her childhood. So this is really about how it's set out on the page when you look at them. Again, you might want to pause before looking at the answers. So I'm a Parrot is, first of all, is set out in verses. Verses and stanzas are the same thing because it is a poem. Most of the verses have 4 lines. In fact, they all have 4 lines until you get right to the bottom. But the account of a childhood is set out like a story. There are paragraphs which are a bit like verses in writing, but they are all of different lengths. Also, some of the verses are repeated like in a song, and it's what I said in response to the last question. It's the ones about him being in the cage. They're all exactly the same, but the account of a childhood is different. Each section is about something different. So that is the basic difference between them. And the final question is, why is it important that the poem I Am a Parrot follows the account of her childhood? So we read about her childhood first before we read the poem. So again, you might want to pause the presentation before you look at the answers. There are many different ways of writing this, but it's basically so that we know that she comes from a place where she had probably seen parrots flying in the wild, which she wouldn't have done in England. She mentions tropical things, and then she writes a poem about a parrot, which is a tropical thing. I think any answer that tells us that the parrot sort of comes from the country that she grew up in, or that she didn't grow up in the centre of a city in England, but she came from this tropical country. Anything like that is really going to be absolutely fine for this answer.